Steam Deck, take one. I've had my Steam Deck OLED for about a month now, and it's my favorite device ever, and that's coming from someone with over 24 computers. I use it all day, and not just for handheld gaming. When I'm not chillaxing like a baller playing my favorite classics, I can plug in a Type-C dongle and turn it into a desktop. And for most tasks, it can replace my computer. I wrote some of this script on it. And to be clear, I haven't replaced my main desktop, but I could. I only went back to my main PC to play Counter-Strike, which unfortunately this little Steam engine could not. But I'm always finding myself surprised by what this mini PC can do, then disappointed by what it can't. And while it's not for everyone, it's plenty for most. If you already have a mid-range to high-end system, this won't replace that, but it's a great secondary or backup, not to mention portable. But if your tasks aren't too demanding and you don't need the highest fidelity frames in the latest games, then this device could potentially replace your PC, if that's what you were interested in for some reason. Unboxing is a simple yet elegant experience. You get a little manual and an 8-foot 45-watt Type-C power cable. This is my Steam Deck. From D-Brand I got the teardown face skin with a kill switch case and a screen protector. They actually give you two
just in case you f it up on your first try.
I went for the OLED version, not just for the better, larger, faster display, but for the under-the-hood improvements. It was manufactured on a smaller process for greater efficiency, as well as a bigger 50 watt-hour battery. You also get faster memory for better graphics performance and a faster Wi-Fi chip. I also went with the cheaper 512 gig model because I know I can upgrade the storage myself. It's up to you if the extra $100 is worth the extra storage out of the box, as well as the anti-glare display and the profile additions it gives you. And there is an albeit cool inner liner to the carrying case that the 512 gig model does not have, but with the kill switch case I think that would have an issue fitting anyway. The device itself is rather large, but it does fit in your hands quite nicely. You've got lots of buttons for your fingers, allowing for many ways to play your games. I often switch between the joysticks and the pads, but the pads can get a little unergonomic after a while, holding the device a little staggered like that. In some games you may find that you can choose between using the D-pad, left joystick, or left trackpad interchangeably. Beautiful for playing how you want to play. The buttons on the back are great as well, and place where your idle fingers can sit, and necessary for extra inputs or binds. I also really love these joysticks. I haven't felt the original Steam Deck's joysticks, but I know these are a little different. And as you probably know, you can replace these with Hall effect joysticks, because these ones can be prone to drift, but until that's an issue present, I won't worry about it. These are fine. Got a couple of other things. There's a dual light sensor in here somewhere to adjust the screen brightness on the fly. Dual microphone, stereo speakers, headphone jack, Type-C for up to 10 gigabits per second, transfer speeds, a little indicator light, volume up and down, you know, the essentials. Oh, and micro SD. Rated for UHC 1, so it's max 100 megabytes a second or whatever. The lowest buttons on the face are the Steam and the button. The Steam button is a menu to navigate between your library, the store, and settings, and it's also a replacement for the Steam overlay while in a game. It allows you to edit your controller configuration per game, as well as checking the game's details, achievements, guides, your personal notes, and how to exit the game or application, which is very handy. SteamOS is very good at closing the opened game or application and returning to the gaming mode interface. Let's see if we can do that right here. Boop, boop. Hey. Holding down the Steam button for one whole second brings up a tooltip for shortcuts that can be very helpful when you feel stuck. Here's the ones I found most useful. Steam plus X brings up the keyboard, and don't worry, every game will remind you on launch. Steam plus B forces a game shutdown. Steam plus left on the D-pad acts as an escape key. This can force close some emulators, and some games might require an escape key press that's not otherwise bound. Holding down the Steam button and moving the right pad or right joystick will make that input act as a mouse, and some games that aren't configured well may need a mouse input but no clear way to use it, but it can get tedious and you can edit the controls per game. Lastly, Steam plus the left joystick up and down will change the brightness of the device. I actually also learned that the button will also act as the same thing for the brightness. Cool. While the button's main job is to open an area for tweaks and settings, as well as a way to access notifications and friends if you have any. In quick settings, you can change brightness and volume as well as connection options. I spend most of my time in the Performance tab, where you can change the overlay level, changing how many metrics are shown. I like number 2, but I try to be conscious of OLED burn-in over time. Within this tab, you can also get a per-game profile, which I usually do if you want to cap the frame rate in a certain game, or you can disable it entirely. Even if you disable VSync in-game, you also need to disable it here. You can also change the scaling mode and filters, which I don't really touch. I've been following SteamOS since 2014, and I've been mildly disappointed for years. But SteamOS 3 is beautiful and works very well out of the box. I'm still waiting on the official image to install on any PC. You can do it yourself, but it's really optimized for the Steam Deck's hardware. There's not too much to look at on the home, a recently played and a what's new section. Library is where you'll probably spend the most of your time. Great on Deck is a good place to start, but most games, even with a little yellow circle, still play perfectly fine. It's mostly the unsupported games that you need to look out for. I've installed a mix of games, mostly for testing, but since I got the 512 gig version, I'm trying not to go overboard. I feel for anyone who got the original 64 gig Steam Deck and hasn't upgraded their storage. Does that person exist? How much storage do you have and use on your Steam Deck? My collections in non-Steam are full of ROMs, for which I use EmuDeck, more on that later. I don't often parse the Steam store, but on this device I do. There was a sale going on, as there usually is, and the store works well on the Steam Deck. But on the Great for Deck page, you can't clearly see the price when you should be able to. Oh well, Valve's probably working on games or something. I haven't tried out the Friends feature, maybe once I have some. Media shows any game soundtracks you may have, as well as any accidental screenshots from your emulators.
You should be able to consistently get over 200 megabits per second download on this thing, but I've seen as high as 700.
There's a lot to do in settings, such as show battery percentage, check for updates. Oh, apparently you can set a PIN as a password, that looks fun. You can set a night mode, and if you're playing a game while it shifts, you feel it in your frame rate as it plummets for a moment. You have Bluetooth, turn that off unless you're actively using it. It drains battery and is an attack vector. You can play with analog. You can buy keyboard themes with Steam points. The on-screen keyboard is necessary, and Valve has been perfecting the typing with pads for a while. There's great haptic as you move between the keys. You can also either push in the pads or use the triggers to select a key, or you can use the joysticks to navigate the keyboard, or just use it as a touchscreen. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good.
That's so nice. It feels good.
There's also startup movies. I like Saturn. You can also budget storage. And there's lots of developer controls to break your system faster. Overall, the menus are easily navigable with the joysticks and ABXY, and if that's not good enough, the touchscreen works as expected. Now click the Steam button, go to power, switch to desktop, and that's where you can unlock this little fella's hidden potential as a full Linux desktop. Remember when Luke and Linus did the Linux challenge in the end of 2021? Remember the year of the Linux desktop? Yeah, around that time I switched to Linux, and I've been on it about 85% of the time since then. In that time, I've gotten used to different flavors of Linux, and my favorite happens to be using KDE as a desktop environment, so I felt right at home here. It's also reminiscent of a Windows interface, so even if you're not used to it, I'm sure you can find your way around. And don't start pussyfooting around like, oh no, Linux terminal. I never use the terminal. Sure, learn it, or don't. I'm not your dad. As you switch to desktop, you'll notice the trackpads work for a moment, and then they don't for a few seconds as Steam launches. This reminds me of the Steam Pad's cousin, present on the Steam controller. That's right, I bought 2 of these suckers back in 2015, and I do enjoy them. Their pads, reminiscent of the ones found on the Steam Deck, are great for moving around the desktop, but also require Steam to function. Probably the same thing going on here. If you want to properly use this in desktop mode, you may need a mouse, keyboard, and maybe a bigger screen too. Well, that's what docking's for. And hot damn, that's $80 for the official dock. I'd consider it if my kill switch didn't require an extension for the USB-C. There are other brands that make Steam Deck accessories like JSO that are much more affordable, or you can use any other dongle like this one I got at Goodwill for $15. It gives me USB-C power in, HDMI, Ethernet, and 2 USB 3 ports. Then I plug in another USB 3 splitter and I've got 5 USB ports. And even that quickly runs out. That and all these USB 3 ports are all sharing 5 gigabits per second. While docked, I initially used the Steam Deck display as a smaller secondary screen, but then I became conscious of the potential OLED burn, and thanks Wolf Den. But that's fair, be conscious of static UI, like that little metrics bar I have at the top. Back to Linux. The Discover Store is essentially an app store for Linux, handy for any Linux user, including you Steam Deck users. You can get by without any of the software, but for the maximum desktop experience, you may need a few extras. Here are some that I use, go find your own opinions. Brave is my favorite web browser with built-in ad blocking. I have two variants of Discord. Discord Screen Audio for when I want to share my screen and audio, and then Standard Discord when I want to view someone else's screen, because for some reason, that doesn't seem to work on Discord Screen Audio. Thanks, Linux. My favorite Office suite is OnlyOffice. This entire video is written in it. GIMP for photo editing, Darktable for importing raw photos from my camera, OBS for screen recording if need be, G4 Music to listen to your music collection, Proton Up Qt for increased Steam compatibility, though I've not needed to use it yet, Steam's Proton is pretty good. Prism Launcher for managing multiple Minecraft instances, and Qubit Torrent for your Linux ISOs. And yes, you can add this software as non-Steam games to run them while in the gaming mode. When I am docked, I'm doing desktop stuff, not gaming. So I'm on YouTube or whatever. When I want to play games, I either use my more powerful system, or more than likely now, I pick up my Steam Deck, lay in bed, and go do some gaming. I've been trying to perfect the gaming in bed strat for a while, and this is the way to go. There's nothing better. Well, I have experienced that longer play sessions will leave me noticing the weight of this device. Like, you can hold it in one hand if you need to, but it becomes a noticeable amount of weight after a while. To get back to gaming mode, click on the desktop icon, or you can log out and you'll reboot back into the SteamOS gaming mode. Alright, so I'm gonna go over a lot of games from Steam, and then later we'll do some emulation. I'm doing all these tests through the gaming mode interface, not through the Linux desktop environment. Well, I did in Counter-Strike 2, but we'll get there when we get there. But first, the footage on the screen is captured through an Elgato HD 60S Plus, and it's mirroring another 16:10 display so I can capture the native 1280x800 of the Steam Deck. Following? Good. I bring this up because that mirrored monitor only allows for 60 Hz, so it won't fully reflect the experience in all cases. Now we can move on. Controller-friendly games are obviously going to be key here. We have a mouse input if we get stuck, but most of the games will rely on all the other inputs as well. And of course, higher fidelity games will drain the battery faster. Games that use 20 plus watts will only net you 2 hours of game time on battery. Not to mention the fan at full tilt is a bit audible. Also, I'll have a little tier list here to keep track of what's a good experience and what isn't. I'm not gonna have an S tier, that's for your favorite game. A tier is great, B tier is pretty good, C is playable, and D is hardly or unplayable. And we don't have an F because that's how things are right now, and it's a bit of a subjective thing, me doing this. But things can get better, so probably different by the time you're watching this. Terraria isn't a game I have much experience with, but I know it's loved by many. Good news though, it works great out of the box, solid 60 FPS and 6 hours of playtime. An A tier if you're into this. Don't Starve estimates 9 hours of battery life, an A tier game on the Steam Deck. I didn't test Don't Starve together, but it's probably similar. I used to play Rocket League back in 2016, and I'd probably put this in A tier. But I'm gonna make an example out of you, Rocket League. When I saw you had to sign into another service, I closed the game. Can't be D tier. Stardew Valley. This game is part of an indie game dev legend and is loved by many, but I haven't played it an awful lot. But I do have some Harvest Moon experience under my belt, so same thing really. It plays perfect, and it's already a hit on the Switch, so it translates perfectly on Steam Deck. You can expect over 7 hours of gameplay. Solid A tier. Cuphead, another easy A tier game on the Steam Deck, and that can give you 6 hours of game time. Cat Quest is a cute RPG with some elements reminiscent of Zelda and Elder Scrolls, but with cats, and lots of cat puns. I love this game. Solid performance, 90 FPS, and you can get about 6 hours of game time on battery. A tier. Overcooked 2, better with friends that you don't mind turning into enemies. You can expect over 5 hours of game time. I didn't get to test this with any friends. Either way, I'm comfortable giving this an A tier. Borderlands 2, the launcher is a little tricky to navigate. You'll need to use Steam plus mouse shortcut. This isn't a game I've played before, but it looks really good and plays well on the Steam Deck. On high settings, it's a pretty consistent 90 FPS and 3 hours of game time. One small gripe is some text elements are a bit small. B tier. Resident Evil 2, kind of expected the Steam Deck to struggle with this game. and hopefully this also applies to the new Resident Evil games on this engine. The game also supports for HDR and looks great on the Steam Deck OLED. You can play on high settings with some dips under 60, or on medium with a good 70 FPS. And you can add some FSR, which will soften the image but boost your FPS substantially. This game plays well, controls and aiming are good, and I could see myself replaying this on Steam Deck, though you may only get 2 hours of game time. B tier. I honestly thought I'd have trouble with Master Chief Collection since it's Microsoft and anti-cheat, but no, you can run on enhanced graphics at a solid 60 FPS for about 4 hours of gameplay. And you can turn down the graphics and cap the frame rate to get your preferred time. But I'll put the Master Chief Collection in B tier, though the aim assist is a little disorienting, but it's also appreciated giving our input handicap. And I also didn't check any online play. That's probably where the anti-cheat will get a little weird, but I didn't try it. I don't know. Cyberpunk 2077. I definitely didn't expect this game to play well, but there is a Steam Deck preset, and while it may look good, though it plays like a slideshow, 30 FPS in a fast-paced environment, not ideal, and it's not even a consistent 30 FPS. It's very jittery, and that coupled with only 2 hours of this mess. You can also opt for the lowest settings, and you can get an inconsistent 60 FPS instead, though now the game looks like shit. I don't really see the appeal here. I don't want to consider this playable. D tier. Helldivers II, not my game, it's Ando's. And I don't really care about this or know what's going on, but on lowest settings it looks like okay. You can get 40 FPS and 2 hours of game time. It plays fine, I guess, but I'm not hooked. D tier. Half-Life plays okay, unless you get good at the touchpad. Any FPS is going to be less than ideal. C tier. Left 4 Dead 2 is a requirement for any computer, and you can be left as well at max settings. There's hundreds of frames to play with, but capped at 60, you can get over 4.5 hours. This game takes advantage of the gyro input, allowing for fairly fine aiming by moving the Steam Deck as opposed to the highly sensitive joystick in this title. I don't know, maybe it was just my controller configuration. C tier. Now, CS2 at lowest settings with FSR, mind you, while at 1080p, because 720p gave me weird bugs like the screen not fitting with artifacts on the edges, or full screen but mouse movement is severely hindered, something perhaps related to dead zones or acceleration. There are moments where CS is playable in deathmatch, and I can still get kills, but with poor fidelity and spiky frame times, and being a game which requires smooth, high frames, it's just not playable, and maybe the only thing holding me back from saying this is the only computer I need. And in case you're wondering, in handheld mode, CS isn't very playable. The controller layout isn't optimal for precision, but if you dongle out to a keyboard and mouse on the built-in display, you can get a playable experience, albeit still lowest settings, and you have to get your face 3 inches from the screen, but I got 3rd place in a deathmatch while recording. So all this footage is also a little choppier because I was using OBS to record at the time. CS2 gets a D for technically playable, but just barely, and you probably shouldn't even want to, you know? Morrowind, for some reason in the graphics settings, identifies the graphics adapter as a Radeon HD 5600, and 1024x768 is the max res by default. Highest settings at that resolution, however, plays smooth and gives us 5.5 hours of game time on battery. However, the look via trackpad and joystick isn't as precise as you'd hope for. I'll put this game in a comfortable C tier. Oblivion on very high settings, HDR, we have an estimated battery life of 5.5 hours, and while it does often stay above 60 FPS, we do have some dips, especially if you max out the shadows and distance, so you can cap the frame rate at 60 and get 6 hours. Either way, B tier. I've been playing this game a lot on the Steam Deck, though it suffers from some joystick level accuracy quirks, but that's not a big deal here. Skyrim Special Edition doesn't give me a launcher to find out what graphics we're running, but it looks good, maybe medium or high, and it's one of those games locked at 60 due to the game speed being tied to the frame rate. For the most part, smooth 60, but during a tussle with the giant there was a quick drop to 45. No biggie, a little over 2 hours. I'm going to put this in B. Dishonored's a very great game from 2009 and holds up today, and doesn't require much these days to run it. At max settings at 1280x800, we have a solid 90 FPS and 5 hours of game time potential. Easy B tier. I'm surprised by how well Dishonored 2 runs. I expected very low settings, which was the default. You can get away with medium settings and still get over 60 FPS, while you'll only get just over 2 hours while drawing 23 watts in my testing, but it looks good and plays good. B tier. Obviously, Doom 2016 will play well. This game is incredibly optimized, and I don't have Doom Eternal yet to test. You'll probably want to use Vulkan rather than OpenGL. Even on medium, I wasn't getting 60 FPS in OpenGL. On Vulkan, I cranked to Ultra with a solid 60. You can get 2 hours of game time, and I find the fast-paced movement hard with the controls. It's a common theme here, and potentially a skill issue. C tier. This Tomb Raider has been a common PC benchmark for many years. I've even 100% my save file. You can play on Ultra settings and cap the frame rate to 60, though you'll only get 2 hours of gameplay. For fun, I tested on low settings, capped at 60, and you get closer to 3 hours that way. This, of course, does require precise aim for the shooting moments of the game, but for the most part, it plays great. B tier, in case you haven't played this game yet. I was really hoping Shadow of the Tomb Raider would perform better. At medium settings, we're still getting dips well below 60, and it's not until low settings that we're smoother, but still not in all areas. Beyond potato quality, the aiming isn't great in high-stress situations, though you can get up to 3 hours of game time here. Unfortunately, D tier. Phasmophobia. I was big into this game a year ago, and it's still fun, but only when it's a challenge. This game also has used more memory than I've seen any other game use, and it's also crashed my Steam Deck. Twice. Either way, a mixture of medium-high settings on the Steam Deck can deliver over 150 FPS, so capped at 60 we can expect over 4 hours of game time. Though at least for me, the controls are a little odd to get used to. I'm familiar with mouse and keyboard, and I worry that precision isn't good enough to grab the little objects quickly. C tier on the Steam Deck. Valheim at lowest settings still looks good, and it's definitely not a deal breaker. You are getting between 60 and 80 FPS, but just over 2 hours of game time. From the control screen, we can see that this game does have Steam Deck support, as they've bothered to add this graphic for it. I'm happy with this experience, but it's not a flawless experience. B tier. Are you a great asset to the company? I found the controls a little weird in Lethal Company, but I'm sure I could get used to them if I didn't want to make my own layout. You should be able to get at least 3 hours of Lethal at 60 FPS, and I do find this to be one of those high-stress games where quick mouse movements are necessary, and the controls fall a little short here, though the gyro in this game works nice. B tier. While Dragon Ball Z Kakarot is shown to be unsupported on the Steam Deck, I didn't run into any problems while trying to launch and run. I played this back in 2020 on my Steam controller, and I picked right back up where I was. And even on highest settings, it seemed to be a consistent 60 FPS, and with an estimated 2.5 hours of gameplay, good experience, B tier. However, I never got into Dragon Ball FigherZ, and the status was unsupported on the Steam Deck due to its anti-cheat, and I had hopes since Dragon Ball Z Kakarot is also unsupported but works. Unfortunately, this game is no dice. Star Wars Battlefront 2004 is nostalgic for me. I played it on the original Xbox, and it's still the same game, but the controls kind of suck, and that's from the top community layout. It's still a little imprecise with aiming. Though it plays well on high settings, you can get about 4 hours of game time. With the current controls, that can be fixed with some time. C tier. Shadow of Mordor, a AAA 2014 game. Very fun at the time. I actually expected the Steam Deck to do a little better here. On high settings, with 100% resolution scale, we're getting 60 FPS with some dips. And if you do want a little higher and more consistent, you can drop the resolution scale to 90%, and that fixes her up pretty nice. It works well with the controller, as I don't have any complaints with the controls, though you only get about 2 hours of game time here. All things considered, B tier. Plants vs. Zombies, Game of the Year. I first played Plants vs. Zombies when I was about 9 on my mom's laptop, and to this day, I have not gotten farther than I was then. This game is a decent example of community controller layouts. By default, you don't have a way to move the mouse, the primary way to interact with the game. And sure enough, the top rated one by default sets all of the joysticks and pads to mouse movement. Very nice. However, touch works as well in this game too. It's suggesting 4 hours of game time, and with the better control layout, I give this game a B tier. Delver's a cute retro-styled RPG dungeon crawler, and has fun themes and fun replayability. And is very light in terms of requirements. You can go high settings and cap at either 90 or 60 FPS and get nearly 9 hours of gameplay. Though there are some small stutters. The controls aren't bad, but it's a native mouse movement game and the pads aren't perfect for accuracy. But it's still super playable. Easy B tier. The Sims 4, at first I was worried that The Sims would have some incompatibilities given it uses an off-platform login from EA, but no, as long as you sign in, it works as expected. At high settings, it's not a consistent 60, more like 40 or 50 FPS, but it actually feels fairly good. But with the highest rated community layout, I couldn't find a way to zoom in and out, so I went with the second best controller layout. It's not the best experience control-wise, but performance is fine. You can get 3 to 4 hours, C tier. Thief 2014 is a reboot of an old series, and with high settings, it plays well, and you'll get somewhere between 3 and 4 hours of game time, B tier. This War of Mine, a side-scrolling game of surviving a war as a few randos. On high settings, it plays well and feels well supported on the Steam Deck, though you only get 3 to 4 hours of game time, B tier. The Escapists is a cute, tiny prison escape simulator. It's capped at 45 FPS and suggests over 10 hours of game time, which is nuts and the highest I've seen yet. However, the controls are clunky, and it would be a lot easier, at least for me, with a mouse. C tier. The Escapists 2 plays better than the original and appears to be much more controller-friendly. While I have more experience with the original game, Escapists 2 feels better to play on this device and gives you 6 hours of game time. A tier. City Skylines, the good one, gets a D tier for being borderline playable. On an empty map, lowest settings, we get 40 to 50 FPS. That's not too bad for a simulation game, but as your city grows, it gets more demanding. I downloaded a New York Manhattan map, and while this may be unrealistic for a city for casual players, it does help illustrate via sub 30 FPS how poor of an experience this is. Dropping the resolution to 640 by 400 doesn't help the frame rate much, and mostly only serves to make your laggy game blurrier. While okay for casual play, on better you can expect 3 hours of gameplay. Again, it's a D. The Witcher 3 isn't a game I've played, but I know it's good. And fairly demanding, though it's a bit older now. Low settings looks good, and that's good because that's what you'll get. There is a Steam Deck preset which is low, and you'll get a comfortable 60 FPS. That's more like it as a Steam Deck preset. Something smooth that looks good. You only get 2 hours of game time, but this looks like it could be a good experience on this device. B tier. I played Plague Inc. on my iPhone 4S in 2013, I believe, and this PC version is better and still fun. It has good lock-on for clicking blips and has pretty easy controls. Only slight downside is that text is small. You can get a smooth 60 FPS and 8 hours of gameplay here. A tier if you squint. Little Nightmares is a cute game I played in 2018, and I do plan to play the sequel at some point. At high settings, while at 60 FPS, you can expect over 3 hours of game time, and at 90 FPS, under 3 hours. Good experience on Steam Deck. A tier. Granny is part of a horror game franchise I played on iOS many years ago. The controls are a bit clunky by default, and there aren't any community layouts. Maybe I'll make one. But once that's locked in, I could see this being a fun experience on Steam Deck. On high settings, no frame drops, and over 4.5 hours of game time. B tier. Soulcalibur is a nostalgic experience for me and my brother, and Soulcalibur VI looks beautiful and runs at a solid 60 FPS on max settings. A fun experience and gives you about 2.5 hours of battery life. Battery life aside, an A tier game for the Steam Deck. House Flipper, another fun game to immerse yourself in. I was playing on lowest settings, but you can get away with high at a solid 60 FPS with about 2.5 hours of game time. B tier. Stray, a cinematic indie futuristic game about a cat. Not sold yet. While it doesn't run on max settings, you'll be limited to about medium. And while there are some dips below 60, it's still beautiful, plays well, and is perfect with controller. So there isn't any awkward translation from mouse and keyboard to controller. You can get a little over 2 hours. I will put this in A tier. Hogwarts Legacy is a pretty demanding game, and it recommends medium settings, but you'll be under 30 FPS here. On lowest settings with FSR 2.0 quality, you can get above 30 FPS most of the time with 2 hours of game time. It's not an optimal experience, though you can get by. D tier. Alright, take one, hopefully final part. There are a lot of emulation handhelds that have exploded over the last few years, and I have one that can do up to N64. The newest ones can do PS2 and GameCube. This, being more powerful and expensive, can do those and more. So as an emulation handheld, the Steam Deck is a great choice. Check out Rust's relatively new video on Retro Game Core about this. It'll help you more than I will. I've had some issues with EmuDeck. Overall, it's great, and better than setting up the emulators yourself. But parsing your ROMs, especially if you have a lot, can be a chore. You'll need a mouse and keyboard to search for your games if it doesn't detect them correctly. You have many options for emulators, and I haven't tried them all to know the difference. Yuzu and Citra are no longer available through EmuDeck, but if you find those app images, they can be imported without much hassle. And if you use your SD card as your ROMs collection, which is what I do, not all data is stored there. Dolphin and RetroArch saves, for example, are on my SSD. and I had to find them after I had upgraded my storage, which was a slight scare and would be a bigger hassle if I didn't have a spare slot on my main rig for the SSD to pull off the data. But most of the emulators are set up and work great with the Steam Deck out of the box, but getting your ROM collection locked in could take a while. PlayStation via DuckStation works great as expected, even at 3x resolution for 720p, though you can perfect the original PlayStation emulation on much smaller, cheaper devices. Through my experience, you have to use the pre-configured radial menu to go to emulator settings to enable analog. I've had to do this every time I boot up a PlayStation game. Depending on the game, you can get 8 hours of game time. Nintendo 64 can have some stutter issues, but for the most part it plays great. It even creates a save state where you can close your game and it jumps right back into where you were. Love it. And you can get just 8 hours of game time here. GameCube performs well through Dolphin and is pre-configured to run at 2x resolution at 720p. You can expect more like 7 hours of game time here. PS2 runs at 2x resolution and does have some stutters, but for the most part they play well, and you can get about 5.5 hours of game time here. Citra runs at a pre-configured 2x native resolution from the 3DS, and the Pokemon I've tested, it runs fairly consistent, with some small hitching, but these aren't high-paced competitive games, rather casual, so a few dips here and there don't bother me. One gripe with either the emulator or the integration with Steam's gaming mode is that the buttons on the back of the Steam Deck change the layout of the two screens, and if you mess with it enough, the two screens no longer fill the display. But after a restart, it goes back to normal. Overall, no big deal, runs great. But on the flip side, the DS emulator doesn't have a clear way to switch the screens, and the radial menu doesn't even work, so I don't know. And that's all the emulators I tested. I didn't try PS3, Xbox, or Wii. Well, I did try one more. Now I have to say, you must back up your own games, because you'll get distracted if you start searching ROM websites.
Why is there so much porn?
Aren't you supposed to be family-friendly, Nintendo? Why are you a giant Continuing without showing you how to find such an emulator, or where to find the keys and firmware, spoilers, dump your own moddable Switch. Which I do have. Here is my moddable Switch, and here's my cart. Let me play my game. So EmuDeck no longer has Yuzu, and I was just a little late. You can add the app image as a non-Steam game and launch your games that way. Now, don't expect for any of these games to play better than on the Switch. In Breath of the Wild, the Switch seems to play this better, and you may get 3.5 hours of game time on the Steam Deck. We're hardly getting 30 FPS. Capped, it's a bit smoother, though we still need FSR. And in Let's Go Eevee, it performs pretty well from what I've seen. So this game plays well and gives you over 5.5 hours. And I won't show you, but I can tell you that Pokemon Violet plays like ass, which I've also heard it does on the Switch, so. Also, I learned something new by talking to the person who has the 1TB Steam Deck OLED. I didn't consider this, but you can run multiple games at once in gaming mode. Just hit the Steam button, go to your library and launch a second or third game. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but a more useful case is setting your browser as a non-Steam game and having that run in the background. So I started playing with this revelation to some weird results. You can have YouTube running in the background, so that's cool, but if you launch multiple games at once, you'll be eating up resources pointlessly. Switching game tabs killed my resolution in Oblivion, and at a not too far point, you'll start lagging in all your games. The system's overall responsiveness becomes laggy, and opening up the Steam menu will also be buggy. I even had launching Shadow of War and Rise of the Tomb Raider at the same time crash and reboot my deck. A really cool feature, but your mileage may vary. First of all, Valve's compatibility through a Proton is essential. I wouldn't have started using Linux without being able to play my favorite games. And that's the only thing holding Linux back from widespread adoption. This is the first step, and they're doing a great job with it. I love how it feels in the hand. It feels robust, not just like a gaming handheld, but like a lifestyle. No, seriously. This thing has given me the confidence and the viability of van life or power-restricted similar means of living. It's an all-around versatile device that either fits in your bag or you get a bag to fit it, lttstore.com. And I love how, depending what I'm playing, I can play for a few hours and the battery still be nearly full. I love how I can look up repair guides and buy replacement parts, how it makes me play the games I wouldn't have played otherwise. Now, one gripe I have that can be fixed via update, if I were to run an application on here as a non-Steam game and then put it to sleep, and then wake it up if I am playing a game on my main computer,
it will crash my main computer's game. For what? I'm sorry? Turning off remote play doesn't fix this either. Like, what? Why?
When you're playing a more demanding game, while I hear the fan is quieter on this model than the LCD model, it still becomes audible. And that sound is typically associated with the games that only give you 2 hours of battery life. But if you want to use this device for as many years as possible, keeping the battery healthy is important. So keeping the battery between 60 and 80%, I hear, is good for long-term battery health rather than constantly running it down to 0 and charging it back up to 100%. Just something to keep in mind, applicable to all of your battery-powered devices. My last main gripe is the weight. This is a hefty device. It needs to be. It's powerful for its size, and that's great. It's an engineering marvel, but holding this suspended for more than an hour becomes taxing on my weak boy pussy arms. And some may take issue with the lack of game availability, how anti-cheats pose issues, and how game launchers other than Steam need workarounds through Linux or don't work entirely. Though I rarely leave Steam for games, and the games I want to play typically don't have restricted anti-cheats that don't play well with Linux, this is a developer problem, and it will eventually work as long as devices like this are bringing Linux to the mainstream and pushing forward compatibility. It's a growing pain, and not necessarily the Steam Deck's fault. Rather, the Steam Deck is the first step in making this compatibility possible.
Now, the price is a little misleading. Don't get me wrong, $550 is a great value for a relatively small and competent gaming computer.
And you can definitely get better frames per dollar if you went with a non-OLED, or refurbished or secondhand. That's not the point I'm making. $549 plus tax, which in my case was about $38, and $549 quickly becomes nearly $600. And now let's not consider our entire Steam library, which we already have, not factoring in the cost of games because that's also not the point.
I also spent $80 on my D-brand skin, kill switch case, and screen protectors to protect my investment.
And if you got the 512 gig because you know you can upgrade it later, 1TB 2230 SSDs cost $70 and 2TB starts at $150. 512 gig micro SD cards start at about $30 and 1TB about $70. That could be $100 to $250 in storage. And on the topic of storage, you're looking for the 2230 NVMe drives, and here's some good picks I found. And for microSD cards, there are a lot of tricky symbols that are always changing, but the most important ones are the V30, the current highest rating for microSD cards, and A2 for the highest application performance. Beyond storage, including a dock or dongle if you want the option to use desktop mode fully, which is killer for this thing's versatility and viability, will raise the price further. Before storage upgrades, I spent $667 on this device. And with a silicon power 1TB micro SD card and a Corsair 2TB 2230 NVMe, I maxed out my Steam Deck in terms of storage. And those 3 terabytes together cost me $260, the most I've ever spent on storage ever. This $550 haha fun device has quickly cost me over $900, and the buyer's remorse has yet to sink in. I mean, this is true for any hobby or thing you start buying. Just be aware that this is not the end of it. You can easily double that price tag to get the full use out of this device. Upgrading the SSD is a simple matter. You'll need to get to the BIOS to put your battery in storage mode if you're a baby and scared of batteries. Also, don't forget to remove your SD card unless you want to buy a new one because your current one will break in half. I also had to remove my kill switch case, but that's a given. You can find the recovery image from Steam's website and use a flashing tool like Rufus on Windows or Etcher if you're a Linux pro. There's 8 T6 screws in the back of the device, and then opening the device with a plastic spudger, you'll have 3 more T6 screws over the shielding. You'll have to gently unstick this ribbon cable, and some other things depending on your Steam Deck's interior layout. Oh yeah, and disconnecting the battery unless you like to live dangerously. Unscrew the stock SSD and put the shielding on your new SSD, and then do all the previous steps in reverse. Using a Type-C flash drive that has the Steam Deck image or through a dongle, reboot the Steam Deck. Damn, look at that arch! Now we're booting from the SD card. Just hit re-image Steam Deck and proceed. It shouldn't take long. But I know you're impatient, so we'll just end this section here. From here, it's normal Steam Deck setup process. Comparing the two drives on KDiskmark shows some improvements, but also some regressions from the stock SSD. And I only have 400 gigs of SteamGames installed on this. You can call this extra storage an unnecessary waste if you're right. Or, if you're like me, you'll argue that maxed out storage on the Steam Deck allows me the buffer of moving other files like video if I were trying to use as my main device.
Also, I did try editing with Kdenlive by opening this video project that I already had going up for my main rig on here, but it would crash. So that's -1 point for the Steam Deck. And in terms of comparing this to an Ally or a Legion or a Claw, I don't know, man. I might just be biased toward Valve or Linux. The other ones either run Windows or use Intel. Frankly, the competition's cool, but the Steam Deck started the revolution. It's by far the most popular, so it should have good support from the community and from Valve, who really feel like the good guys. I don't know, follow your heart. This is what I went with. So if you're not currently waiting for yours to arrive and are just binging all the Steam Deck content to live vicariously through us, and instead you're on the fence and don't know if you can shell out 0.5 to 1K on this toy, for the OLED model, I say do it. What have you got to lose? Your car? Your house? Your wife? Your kids? Well, like, once those are gone, you've got more time and money for this, hey? What I'm trying to say is, they say money can't buy happiness, but money bought the Steam Deck.